The Line and the Stars. The Milky Way had known peace for nearly a century. Humanity's expansion into the stars had been met with cautious diplomacy rather than conflict, a pleasant surprise to the galactic community that had observed Earth's violent history with trepidation. Humans were known for their adaptability, their creativity, and their fierce protection of their own. Yet few species truly understood just how far that protective instinct could reach. The Vexari Confederation occupied the space 2 sectors away from human territory. Tall, with iridescent skin that shifted between deep violet and midnight blue, they were a species driven by scientific discovery and the pursuit of knowledge. Their society prided itself on logic and advancement, often at the expense of empathy, a concept they viewed as inefficient sentimentality. Relations between humans and Vexari have been cordial if somewhat cool, maintained through careful diplomatic channels and mutually beneficial trade. Commander Elena Reyes stood on the observation deck of the HSS Artemis, watching as the diplomatic vessel approached Nexus Station, a neutral hub where species from across the quadrant could mingle freely under protected status. As Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council, she carried the weight of humanity's interests on her shoulders. "Nervous, Commander?" asked Dr. Marcus Chen, the ship's exobiologist and her closest friend aboard. Elena smiled slightly. "Just focused. The Vexari are requesting additional mining rights in the Cantor Belt. We need those minerals just as much as they do. You'll find a compromise. You always do." What neither of them knew was that this routine diplomatic mission would soon become irrelevant. Light years away, on the border colony world of Harmony, an event was unfolding that would shatter the fragile peace between species. 9-year-old Sophie Nakamura loved the alien flowers that bloomed on Harmony's southern continent. Their petals changed color when touched, responding to the electrical signals in a person's skin. Her parents, both xenobotanists, had moved to the colony when she was just 4, seeking to study the unique flora that thrived in the planet's unusual atmosphere. "Don't wander too far, Sophie," her father called as she skipped ahead along the path that led from their research station to the Crystal Lake, where many of the specimens grew. "I won't, Dad," she called back, already distracted by a particularly vibrant cluster of star-shaped blooms. Dr. Eli Nakamura smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. He and his wife, Mai, had worried about raising a child so far from Earth, but Sophie had thrived on Harmony, developing a curiosity and wonder about the universe that made them both proud. He turned back to his collection case, cataloging the samples they'd gathered that morning. It would take only 3 minutes, 3 minutes of inattention, for their world to collapse. The Vexari research vessel had landed without authorization on the far side of the lake, its crew eager to collect biological samples before the human colonists noticed their presence. Chief Researcher Zevix hadn't bothered with permits. In his view, scientific progress trumped bureaucratic protocols. Sophie, drawn by the strange lights of the vessel partially visible through the tree line, had wandered closer. To her 9-year-old mind, it looked like something from her favorite holo stories, sleek and mysterious. "Hello," she called out, stepping into the clearing where the ship rested. "Are you visitors? I know all about aliens. My parents study plants from all over the galaxy." Researcher Tav was the first to spot her, this small human child approaching without fear. In Vexari society, offspring were kept sequestered in educational compounds until they reached maturity. The sight of this free-roaming immature human was both fascinating and perplexing. "What is it doing here?" Tav asked his superior. Zevix's multifaceted eyes narrowed with interest. "A juvenile specimen. How fortunate. Our behavioral studies on humans have lacked data on the developmental stages. Protocol dictates we should avoid contact with the colonists," another researcher warned. "This isn't contact," Zevix replied coolly. "This is opportunity." Sophie never had the chance to run. The stun field they deployed dropped her instantly, her small body crumpling to the ground like a discarded doll. By the time Dr. Nakamura realized his daughter was missing and organized a search party, the Vexari ship had already broken atmosphere. Sophie's unconscious form sealed in a stasis pod deep within its laboratory section. The following weeks were a blur of desperate communications, diplomatic outrage, and escalating tensions. The Vexari Confederation acknowledged their research vessel's presence on Harmony, but claimed no knowledge of the missing human child. Earth's representatives, including Commander Rice, hastily recalled from her previous assignment, presented evidence. Sophie's DNA found at the Vexari landing site, atmospheric disturbance patterns matching their vessels, witness accounts from colonists who had spotted the ship. This is a severe diplomatic incident, Commander Rice stated firmly in the emergency council session. We demand the immediate return of Sophie Nakamura and those responsible for her abduction. The Vexari High Minister's expression remained impassive. We are conducting an internal investigation. If any of our citizens have violated protocols regarding interaction with other species, they will be disciplined accordingly. Disciplined accordingly. Elena fought to keep her voice level. A child has been taken from her parents. This isn't about protocols. It's about a heinous crime. Perhaps, the minister replied. Your emotional response is clouding your judgment, Commander. Rest assured, if we locate the child, appropriate action will be taken. 37 days after Sophie's disappearance, the truth emerged, not through diplomatic channels, but through a horrifying data leak. An anonymous source within the Vexari scientific community transmitted files to multiple human outposts simultaneously. Research logs, medical scans, dissection records. Sophie Nakamura had been alive for 29 days in Vexari custody. They had studied her reactions to various stimuli, some painful, some terrifying, recorded her pleas for her parents, documented her tears, noted the precise moment her heart gave out. The final entry was clinical. Terminal stage reached earlier than anticipated. Specimens' physiological responses to stress less robust than adult humans. Data collected will advance understanding of human vulnerability significantly. When Commander Rice viewed the files in her secure office aboard the HS Artemis, she vomited. Then she wept. Then she made the call that would change the course of human history. Mr. President, she said, her voice hollow, they didn't just take her. They tortured her to death. In the name of science. The silence on the other end lasted 10 seconds. When President Omar Hassan spoke, his voice was unnaturally calm. Send me everything. I'm calling an emergency session of the Global Defense Council. Sir, Elena hesitated. The Galactic Charter prohibits unilateral military action without. Commander, the President interrupted. As of this moment, the Charter is suspended. Prepare your ship for combat operations. Within 24 hours, every human vessel across the galaxy received the same coded transmission. BLACKSHIELD active. It was a contingency that many had trained for, but none expected to implement. The total mobilization of humanity's military forces for species-level threat response. On Earth and every colony world, military reserves were activated. Civilian ships were commandeered and retrofitted for combat roles. Weapons systems that had been banned by the Galactic Charter, planet killers, nova inducers, consciousness disruptors, were removed from deep storage. The Vexari, realizing too late the scale of their miscalculation, attempted to make amends. They arrested Chief Researcher Zevix and his team, offering them up as sacrifices. They proposed reparations, including technology transfers and territorial concessions. We did not authorize these research methods, the High Minister insisted during an emergency broadcast. The actions of these rogue scientists do not represent the Vexari people. His transmission was met with silence. No human diplomat responded. No negotiations were offered. The first strike came without warning. The Vexari colony on Taurus IV, a research outpost housing nearly 20,000 scientists and their families, vanished in a blinding flash as a quantum demolition charge detonated in its core. No evacuation warning. No survivors. The Galactic Council erupted in outrage and fear. The Ashuri Republic, longtime mediators in interspecies conflicts, attempted to broker peace. This response violates all principles of proportionate justice, their ambassador declared. One child's life, however tragic the circumstances, cannot justify the annihilation of thousands. Admiral Jackson Chen of the Earth Fleet addressed the Council with chilling composure. You misunderstand our intentions. This isn't punishment. This isn't vengeance. This is a promise. He displayed the image of Sophie Nakamura, not the clinical autopsy photos from the Vexeri lab, but a school portrait taken months before her death. A smiling child with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. Look at her, the Admiral commanded. Remember her face. Sophie Nakamura died frightened and alone, begging for her parents while your respected colleagues noted her reactions with scientific detachment. What happened on Taurus Ivy wasn't an eye for an eye. It was merely our opening statement. The council chamber fell silent. Humanity has a message for the galaxy, Admiral Chen continued. We have drawn a line in the stars. Cross it at your peril. Harm our children, and your entire species becomes negotiable. As the HSS Artemis and its battle group moved into position around the Vexari homeworld, Commander Reyes stood once again on the observation deck. The planet below was beautiful, swirling clouds of lavender and azure above continents dotted with gleaming cities. This feels wrong, Dr. Chen said quietly, joining her at the viewport. Those cities are full of civilians, families. Elena didn't look at him. So was Harmony. Sophie wouldn't want this, he pressed. You know she wouldn't. Commander Reyes finally turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. What Sophie wanted was to go home to her parents. What Sophie deserved was to grow up, fall in love, live her life. What she got instead was a cold metal table and researchers who didn't even see her as a person. She looked back at the planet. The Vexari made a fundamental error, Marcus. They thought we valued rules more than our children. They're about to learn how wrong they were. In orbit above the Vexari homeworld, humanity's fleet assembled. Hundreds of ships, from massive dreadnoughts to agile destroyers, all weapons primed and ready. And across the galaxy, species who had once viewed humans as merely another ambitious young race now watched with growing horror as they demonstrated exactly how far they would go to protect their own. The question on every mind: how would this end? And would the galaxy ever be the same again? Reckoning. The Vexari planetary defense grid was the most sophisticated in their sector. A seamless network of orbital platforms, atmospheric disruptors, and ground-based energy cannons capable of reducing incoming vessels to their component atoms. It had never been breached, never been tested in full-scale conflict. It failed in 17 minutes. Human ships didn't rely on brute force. They deployed something the Galactic Council had deemed too dangerous for warfare: quantum entanglement disruptors that simply disconnected the grid's systems from one another. The defense platforms continued to function, but no longer as parts of a coherent whole. The Vexari commanders watched in horror as their coordinated defense collapsed into isolated, ineffectual nodes. They're toying with us, General Morax said, his iridescent skin fading to ashen gray as he watched the tactical display. They could have destroyed the platforms, but instead they've rendered them useless while keeping them intact. Supreme Hierarch Zuvax, the highest authority in the Vexari Confederation, stared at the orbital feed with mounting dread. They want us to understand our helplessness before they strike. Supreme Hierarch, his aide whispered urgently, the human commander is requesting direct communication. Visual link. Zyvax smoothed his ceremonial robes. Even facing extinction, protocol mattered. Connect them. Commander Elena Reyes' face appeared on the main display, her expression unreadable. Behind her stood several high-ranking human officers, their faces equally impassive. Supreme Hierarch, she acknowledged with a curt nod. I trust our demonstration has made our capabilities clear. Zyvax straightened to his full height. Commander Reyes, the Vexari Confederation formally acknowledges its grievous error in the matter of the human child, Sophie Nakamura. We offer unconditional surrender and reparations as you see fit. Alina's expression didn't change. This isn't a negotiation, hierarch. We're not here for your surrender. Then what do you want? Fear crept into Zivax's voice, despite his best efforts. Justice, Alina replied simply. The beings directly responsible for Sophie's abduction and death have already been executed by your government. That's insufficient. We've transmitted all research data related to the incident, Zivax said quickly. We've implemented new laws prohibiting any research on sentient beings without explicit consent and oversight. We've dismantled the entire division responsible. Again, insufficient. Alina leaned forward slightly. You've failed to understand the fundamental issue, Supreme Hierarch. This wasn't just about rogue scientists. It's about a culture that enabled them. A society that views other sentient beings as potential test subjects. A civilization that considers scientific advancement more important than basic dignity. Zivax's aide whispered urgently in his ear, showing him data on a small screen. The human fleet was moving into precise positions around the planet. What are your terms? Zivax asked, his voice barely audible. Commander Reyes glanced down at something off-screen before meeting his gaze again. In 1 hour, every Vexari ship capable of interstellar travel will be granted safe passage to evacuate essential personnel from your homeworld. You have 12 hours total to evacuate who you can. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. You cannot be serious, Zivax stammered. There are 5 billion Vexari on our homeworld. Billions more on our colonies. You're proposing genocide over the actions of a few. We're proposing consequences, Alina corrected coldly. And I'd just given you 12 hours to save as many of your people as possible. I suggest you use that time wisely and instead of wasting it on pleas that will change nothing. The transmission cut. In the silence that followed, General Morax turned to his leader. Your orders, Supreme Hierarch. Zivax's hands trembled. Begin the evacuation. Priority to genetic repositories, cultural archives. And, he hesitated, juveniles. On the HSS Artemis, Alina stepped away from the communications array, her shoulders rigid with tension. Are we really going through with this? Dr. Chen asked quietly, falling into step beside her as she strode down the corridor. Those are our orders, she replied without looking at him. Alina. He grabbed her arm, forcing her to stop. This isn't justice. This is extinction. You know what this makes us. She yanked her arm free, eyes blazing. What it makes us is clear, Marcus. It makes us a species that cannot be preyed upon. It makes us a species that other civilizations will think twice. No, 1,000 times, before harming. At the cost of our humanity, he countered. A small price for ensuring no human child ever suffers Sophie's fate again. As the evacuation of the Vexari homeworld began, a chaotic, desperate exodus, news spread throughout the galaxy. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, voting overwhelmingly to condemn humanity's actions. Sanctions were proposed. Military intervention was discussed. None of it mattered. Human ships were already positioned near key council worlds, not threatening, simply present. A reminder of capabilities recently demonstrated. On Earth, the reaction was mixed. Millions marched in protest against what they viewed as disproportionate brutality. Others held vigils for Sophie, her smiling face projected onto buildings worldwide, her name a rallying cry for those who believed the response was justified. President Hassan addressed the global population. For too long, humanity has been viewed as the galaxy's younger sibling, passionate but harmless, to be humored but not truly respected. The tragedy of Sophie Nakamura has forced us to send a message that will resonate for generations. Humanity's children are sacrosanct. The price for harming them is higher than any species can afford to pay. Aboard the HSS Artemis, the countdown continued. 10 hours until deployment of the planet killers. 9. 8. In her quarters, Commander Reyes stared at Sophie's image. The girl's smile seemed to mock her now. Innocent, trusting, everything that Elena had once believed about the universe herself. Her comm unit chimed. "Commander," her XO's voice came through. "We're receiving an unusual transmission. Multiple sources, encrypted channels. It appears to be coming from Vexeri children." Elena's head snapped up. "What? They've bypassed official channels, using some kind of distributed network. They're asking to speak with you directly." A voice in her head, one that sounded suspiciously like Marcus, whispered that this could be manipulation, a last desperate attempt to appeal to human sympathy. But another part of her needed to know. "Put it through to my quarters." No record. The screen flickered, and Elena found herself looking at a group of young Vexeri. Their skin still pale, lacking the iridescent quality of adults, their eyes proportionally larger in their narrow faces. "Commander of Earth," one of them began, her voice high and musical. "I am Lyrics. We have studied your Sophie Nakamura. We know what was done to her." Elena's throat tightened. "Then you know why we're here." Another juvenile stepped forward. "We do. And we do not dispute your right to justice. But we ask, would Sophie want this?" The question hit Elena like a physical blow. The same words Marcus had used. "You didn't know her," Elena said softly. "No," Lyrics agreed. "But we have learned of her. She studied the flowers that change colors when touched. She collected specimens to understand them better. She approached unknown beings without fear." The young Vexari's eyes, so different from human eyes, and yet somehow conveying the same innocence, fixed on Elena. Would someone who loved discovery want to be the reason for destroying all that could be discovered? 6 hours remained on the countdown when Commander Reyes requested an emergency communication with President Hassan. Their conversation lasted 22 minutes. No records exist of what was said. At the 5-hour mark, Elena called an all-hands meeting of the fleet's senior officers. "There has been a change in plans," she announced, her voice steady but subdued. "The planet killers will not be deployed." A murmur swept through the assembled officers. "Instead," she continued, "we will implement Operation Sentinel. The Vexari homeworld will be placed under human protectorate status for the next 50 years. Their military capabilities will be dismantled. Their research facilities will operate under human oversight. A percentage of their economic output will fund the Sophie Nakamura Foundation, dedicated to educating species across the galaxy about ethical treatment of all sentient beings." Admiral Cortez frowned. "Commander, with all due respect, these people murdered a child. They treated her like a lab specimen. They need to pay the ultimate price." Elena met his gaze steadily. "They will pay. Every day for 50 years, they'll live with human ships in their skies, human boots on their ground, human eyes watching their every move. They'll rebuild their society under our supervision, with our values ingrained in their institutions. Their children will grow up learning about Sophie Nakamura and understanding exactly why their freedom was forfeit." She paused, looking around the room. "We came here ready to be exterminators. I'm asking you now to become something harder, architects of a new Vexari civilization that will never again view other species as beneath dignity or protection." The following decades transformed the galaxy. The Vexari Protectorate became a model of rehabilitation. Painful, sometimes contentious, but ultimately successful. The species that had once prided itself on cold logic and detached observation learned to balance advancement with empathy. Other civilizations noted the changes with varying degrees of approval and concern. But one thing became universally acknowledged. Humanity had drawn a clear boundary. While they had ultimately chosen mercy over extinction, no one doubted that the choice had been theirs to make. 20 years into the Protectorate period, a memorial was unveiled in the center of the Vexari capital city. The statue depicted Sophie Nakamura tending to the color-changing flowers she had loved, with an inscription in both human and Vexari languages. "For Sophie, who loved discovery. May her memory teach us that true progress never comes at the cost of compassion." Commander Elena Reyes, now Ambassador Reyes, stood beside Dr. Marcus Chen as the memorial was dedicated. Her hair had grayed at the temples, lines etched around her eyes from 2 decades of overseeing the most ambitious cultural rehabilitation project in galactic history. Was it worth it? Marcus asked quietly as Vexeri children, the first generation raised under the Protectorate, place iridescent flowers at the statue's base, choosing this path instead of the other. Elena watched as a young Vexari girl carefully arranged her flower, her movements gentle and reverent. Sophie would have liked them, she said simply. She always did love seeing things grow. In the decades that followed, as the Protectorate gradually transitioned to independence, a new term entered the diplomatic lexicon of the galaxy, the Nakamura line. It referred to boundaries that could not be crossed without existential consequences, specifically, the treatment of the young and vulnerable of any species. When the last human oversight ship departed Vexeri space 30 years later, they left behind a transformed civilization, one that had integrated the protection of innocence into their once coldly logical worldview. And across the galaxy, species that might once have viewed humans as soft or overly emotional now understood a fundamental truth. Humanity's capacity for mercy was matched only by its capacity for devastating retribution. The choice between the two hinged on a line drawn in the stars, a line named after a 9-year-old girl who had once loved flowers that changed colors when touched. In the great annals of galactic history, scholars would later identify this moment as the true beginning of humanity's ascendance, not through conquest or technological superiority, but through the establishment of a moral principle so clear and so fiercely defended that it reshaped interspecies relations for millennia to come. The children of every species are sacred, and those who forget this truth need only remember the name Sophie Nakamura to understand the cost of such forgetfulness.